All right, so welcome to U.S. History with Mr. McCurr. This is our introductory unit. Then you can use these videos as a way to review topics that we have covered in class. So to start off, a quick review of American history. So our first chapter is basically covering what you guys covered over the course of most of your 8th grade year. So just a few really quick review questions that we will make sure we cover in class. What do you know about Christopher Columbus? How much do you know about Native Americans and Native American culture in the Americas before British exploration and French and Spanish exploration? How much do you know about the early American colonies and why those colonies were created? What was the Mayflower Compact, the first example of a government in the colonies in the Americas? And then what were some of the differences socially, economically, culturally between what we call the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies? Like I said, all of that is just review from things you should have already learned in 8th grade, and we'll make sure we cover those in class in more detail. So let's start off with influences on our colonies and eventually our Constitution and form of government. Starting off with the Magna Carta, which was written in 1215. I always like to try and put that in a little bit perspective, that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So we're talking about, 250 plus years before Columbus explored America that the Magna Carta was written. So this thing's really old. And it's one of the first documents that identifies the idea of a limited monarch, somebody that does not have absolute power. Why is this such a big deal? Why is it significant? Because monarchs are anointed by who? By God himself to lead their people. So when barons and other noblemen in Britain put this check on the king, it was identifying that the king absolutely was a human and did not have absolute rule over them. It's the first document that we really have in what we would consider kind of a modern era that limits the power of a king. Huge deal. Next, we have the English Bill of Rights, and you see that's in red because it's not a part of your note packet, but just really quickly, we have a Bill of Rights where we protect things like religion, speech, the right to trial, the right against cruel and unusual punishment. All those things we stole from the English Bill of Rights. They had it there first, and we kind of took it from them. Some more things you want to make sure you're aware of: democratic ideas in colonies. The Enlightenment and the Great Awakening were two things that were huge influences on the United States of America. So, the Enlightenment, what was it? Well-educated American colonists were a part of this international movement, mainly European movement, of instead of just looking at the world at face value and saying, well, that's the way it's always been, they start asking the question that I like to say, the world becomes 2-year-olds. Okay, what do 2-year-olds always ask? Why? Why? Why is the sky blue? Why am I not allowed to stand on the couch? Why am I not allowed to smack my dog in the face? They ask the question why. In the Enlightenment, people start asking the question why, but not necessarily about those simple aspects, but things like, why is this oil flammable? Why are we not trying to innovate new ways of doing things to make life easier for people? What is the role of government? Philosophical questions as well. And there are several famous Americans involved in what we would call the Enlightenment that are parts of this. And we use aspects of the Enlightenment to help us declare our independence, to help us write our Constitution. It plays a major role on the development of the United States. Some of those key Americans would be people like Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin that were involved in the Enlightenment. Next, the Great Awakening. So there are two Great Awakenings. There's the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is happening in the 1740s. And you have evangelical preachers getting crowds of thousands of people as they travel across the colonies. You kind of have this religious revival. And the reason this is important is that individuals in the colonies are starting to see a separation from themselves and the king as the leader of their religion. So they're starting to preach about an individual relationship with God, and and people are figuring out you can worship God how you see best fit. And you also start to see this relationship and dynamic change. If I can create my own relationship with God and decide I want to worship how it best suits me, why should I not be able to rule over myself and my government and make those same types of democratic decisions within my government? So the Great Awakening, although it's a religious movement, has a major impact on the development of the American government. Next, we have this Enlightenment activity. This is something that we will be doing in class, where you have to choose certain rights that you think people should have. It's a discussion about the establishment of government in basic terms. Okay, one important political philosopher you're going to need to know is John Locke. John Locke writes several different books about the role of government and his philosophy on what are the most important things for a government to do. And he boils it down to essentially the government's job is to protect three things for its citizens: a citizen's life, a citizen's liberty or freedom, and their property. Okay, so that should sound familiar to you. There's a really famous line in the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson stole: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness sounds better in a document like the Declaration that was meant to be read aloud. But John Locke's argument was essentially, look, citizens enter into a government. And when they enter into this government, they create a contract, what he calls the social contract, with the people and the government. The people are giving up some of their privacy, some of their freedom to enter into this government. You're going to be punished for killing somebody if you live under a government. That's the social contract that you've entered. If you live in a state of nature without any rules, without any repercussions to your actions, you could murder somebody and there would be no punishment. That's not the society we live in. So John Locke says that these are the three rights that are most essential and most important. Okay, now we're fast forwarding a little bit. So we're skipping over, a century and a half worth of British rule over the colonies. And to understand, for most of this time period, it was called salutary neglect. All that means is that the colonies were largely left alone. They operated on their own. If you lived in Maryland, you had governor of Maryland, you had local governments in Maryland, you would consider yourself a subject of the British Crown, but you largely didn't pay taxes to Britain, you paid taxes to Maryland, and you operate under Maryland law. You didn't really have any direct ties to the British. Well, then Native Americans find an alliance in the French, who agree to help them try and take some of their land back from the British settlers. And the French and British are longtime enemies in Europe. And this is a great opportunity for the French to try and gain additional inroads with the Native Americans and potentially better trading partners. So they fight a war. The French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War. The British help us win this war. Essentially, the British win the war. They send over their military. They send over their navy. They send over their top generals. They win the war for us. But once the war's over, they ask the crazy, unreasonable thing of saying, all right, colonists, now you got to pay for this. You're going to have to pay for it through taxes, and you're going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So what happens? They begin what's called the Proclamation of 1763, saying that Americans can no longer expand west. The Appalachian Mountains are the western limit of the American colonies. Next, the Stamp Act and Tea Act. The Stamp Act taxes paper products where they would put a stamp on them and you would be charged a tax. The Tea Act taxes the purchases of tea. Americans are outraged by this. They had never had to pay these taxes before. And the famous colonist retaliation of the Tea Act, the Boston Tea Party, throwing the tea in Boston Harbor, millions of dollars worth of tea in today's money. And lastly, the British sent over their military to live in our homes during peacetime, after the war was over. These all caused outrage with the colonists.